Last time we spoke about the February 26 incident. Within the turbulent government of assassination period of the 1930s in Japan, a faction of discontented junior officers known as the Kotaha Faction believed that their emperor, Hirohito, was being manipulated by corrupt politicians and businessmen. In a desperate bid for what they termed a Showa restoration, they meticulously planned a coup d'etat. On February 26, they launched a rebellion in Tokyo, attempting to assassinate key figures they deemed responsible for undermining the emperor's authority. The young officers executed coordinated attacks on prominent leaders, resulting in several deaths, while hoping to seize control of the imperial palace. However, their plan unraveled when their actions met with unexpected resistance. They failed to secure strategic locations. Dark snow blanketed the city as Hirohito, outraged by the violence, quickly moved to suppress the uprising, which ultimately led to the downfall of the Kotaha faction and solidified the military's grip on power, ushering in a new era marked by militarism and radicalism. This episode is the Suiyuan Operation. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia. Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released the Defense of the Great Wall of China 1933. And on Echoes of War, we're finishing up our multi-part series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The latest exclusive podcast is on the government by assassination period. So it's kind of like the last episode we covered, but a lot more. So we last left off with the February 26 incident breaking out Japan. But now I'd like to return back to China. Now, we spoke a little bit about some influential Japanese politicians in the previous episode, such as Prime Minister Saito Makoto, who oversaw Japan from May of 1932 to July of 1934, and he was succeeded by Prime Minister Keisuke Okada from July of 1934 to March of 1936. The foreign policy of Japan towards China during the Saito and Okada administrations exhibited a notable paradox, characterized by two conflicting elements. On one hand, Foreign Minister Hirota championed a diplomatic approach that emphasized friendship, cooperation, and accommodation with China. On the other hand, the military actively undermined the authority of the nationalist government in northern China, creating a significant rift between diplomatic rhetoric and military action. The Okada cabinet then endorsed the Army Ministry's outline of policy to deal with North China on January 13th of 1936. This policy document explicitly proposed the eventual detachment of 5 provinces, Hubei, Chahar, Shanxi, Suiyuan, and Shandong, from the nationalist government Nanjing. The approval of this outline marked a pivotal moment as it presented the first official government endorsement of the military's long-standing agenda, and it underscored the Army's evolution from a mere rogue entity operating in the region to the de facto authority dictating the course of Japanese policy towards China. Despite this, on January the 22nd, during the 68th Diet Session, Hirota reaffirmed his dedication to fostering better ties with China, to which a representative from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs responded positively. The nationalist government in Nanjing also expressed interest in engaging in formal negotiations. However, this diplomatic initiative quickly faltered, and the expected discussions in Nanjing never took place. Shortly thereafter, a mutiny by young army officers on February 26 of 1936 led to the fall of the Okada cabinet. Following Prince Kenoi Fumimaru's refusal of the imperial mandate to form a new government, Hirota stepped in to establish a cabinet on March 9th. General Tarachi Hisaichi was appointed as the Minister of the Army. Admiral Nagano Osami took charge of the Navy Ministry, and Babeiichi became the Finance Minister. Hirohito briefly served as foreign minister until Arita Hachiro, who had just submitted his credentials as ambassador to China on March the 6th, returned to Japan. The Hirohito Kokai cabinet, established immediately following the February 26 incident, further entrenched military influence in politics, while allowing inter-service rivalries to impede national objectives. In May of 1936, Hirohito, influenced by army and naval ministers, reinstated the practice of appointing military ministers solely from the ranks of high-ranking active duty officers. He believed this would prevent associations with the discredited Imperial Way faction, or Kotaha Faction, from regaining power. By narrowing the candidate pool and enhancing the army's power relative to the prime minister, Hirohito's decision set the stage for army leaders to leverage this advantage to overthrow Admiral Yonai's cabinet in July of 1940, for example. Arita began his new job by meeting with the foreign minister Cheng Chen, while hearing views from the Kuangtung Army Chief of General Staff, Itagaki Seishiro. Yes, our old friend received a lot of promotions since we last talked about him. Itagaki had this to say about the Kuangtung Army's policy in China. The primary aim of Japan's foreign policy is the sound development of Manchukuo, based upon the principle of indivisibility of Japan and Manchukuo. If, as is probable, the existing situation continues, Japan is destined sooner or later to clash with the Soviet Union, and the attitude of China at that time will gravely influence operations against the Soviet Union. The Kuenteng Army was growing more and more nervous about the USSR following its 7th Comintern Congress held in July and August of 1935. There it publicly designated Japan, Germany, and Poland as its main targets of Comintern actions. Japanese intelligence within the Red Army also knew the Soviets were gradually planning to expand the military strength so they could face a simultaneous West and East Front war. This was further emboldened by the latest USSR's 5-year plan. Alongside the growing Red Northern menace, the CCP issued on August 1st a declaration calling upon the nationalist government to end their civil war so that they could oppose Japan. By this time, the CCP was reaching the end of its long march and organizing a new base of operations in Yinan in northern Shanxi province. The developments by the USSR and the CCP had a profound effect on Japan's foreign policy in China. The Kuangtung Army believed a war with the USSR was imminent, and they began to concentrate their main forces along the border of Manchukuo. The Kuangtung Army's plan in the case of a war was to seize Vladivostok while advancing motorized units towards Ulaanbaatar in Outer Mongolia, hoping to threaten the Trans-Siberian Railway near Lake Baikal. Their intelligence indicated the USSR could muster a maximum of about 250,000 troops in eastern Siberia, and that Japan could deal with them with a force 2/3 of that number. Now, at that point, the Imperial Japanese Army had inferior air forces and armaments, thus urgent funding was needed. By the way, for those who are interested, I actually did an episode over on my Patreon, yes, it is behind that wall, about the hypothetical war between Japan and the USSR, that being called What If Hoku Shinran actually came about. And I don't want to ruin it because it's one of my best episodes, to be honest. Very well researched. I do recommend it. I don't want to ruin it, but it wouldn't go very well for Japan. But I desist. If you want to go listen to that, please go check out the Patreon or my YouTube membership. It's, of course, found over there. Now, to increase funding, the Kuangtung Army leadership proposed doing away with special allowances for Japanese officials in Manchuria and reorganizing the Japanese economic structure. The Kuangtung Army leaders also knew that the submarine base at Vladivostok posed a significant threat to Japanese shipping, so the Navy would have to participate, especially against the ports and airfields. All said and done, the Kuangtung Army planned for a war set in 1941 and advised immediate preparations. On July the 23rd of 1936, Ishiwara Kanji presented the Army's document titled Request Concerning the Development of Industries in Preparation for War. This was given to the Army Ministry. He asserted that in order to prepare for potential conflict with the Soviet Union, Japan, Manchukuo, and North China must have the industries critical for full war development by 1941. Ishiwara emphasized the urgent need for rapid industrial growth, particularly in Manchukuo. He followed this request on July the 29th with a draft of a Policy on Preparations for War regarding the Soviet Union, advocating for immediate reforms to Japan's political and economic systems to facilitate economic expansion and lay the groundwork for future fundamental changes. However, he cautioned that if significant turmoil erupted in economic sectors, Japan must be ready to execute a comprehensive overhaul without any delay. At the same time, the Hirohito cabinet initiated a review of its policy towards China. In the spring of 1936, a secret committee focused on the current situation was formed. It's consisting of officials from the Army, Navy, and Foreign Ministries. Their discussions led to the adoption of measures to implement policy towards China by the Foreign Ministers' Conference on August 11th, along with the second outline of policy to address North China, which the cabinet approved as part of the fundamentals of national policy on the same day. The first of these documents outlined the following actionable steps. Number 1. Conclusion of an anti-communist military pact. Part A. To prepare for the conclusion of such a pact, a special secret committee of military experts from both countries should be organized. Part B. Their discussions should cover the scope and substance of the pact and ways and means of realizing the objectives of said pact. Part 2. Conclusion of the Sino-Japanese military alliance. A secret committee composed of an equal number of delegates from each nation should be organized to prepare for the conclusion of an offensive and defensive alliance against attack by a third country. Number 3. Acceleration of solutions of pending questions between China and Japan. Part A. Engagement of senior political advisor. The nationalist government should engage a senior Japanese political advisor to assist in the conduct of the domestic and foreign affairs of the nationalist government. Part B. Engagement of military advisors. The nationalist government should engage military advisors along with military instructors. Part C. Opening of an airline services between China and Japan. Airline services between China and Japan should be opened immediately. To realize such a service, various means should be used to induce the Nanjing authorities to establish an airline cooperation in North China, to begin flights between Formosa and Fujian province, and to start test flights between Shanghai and Fukuoka. Part D. Conclusion of a reciprocal tariff treaty. A reciprocal tariff treaty should be concluded promptly between China and Japan, on the basis of the policy approved by ministries concerned, with regard to the abolition of special trade in eastern Hubei province, and the lowering of the prohibitively high tariffs. For this purpose, Japan should, if necessary, propose the creation of a special committee composed of Japanese and Chinese representatives. Number 4. Promotion of economic cooperation between China and Japan. Japan should promote cooperation with the common people of China to establish realistic and inseparable economic relations between China and Japan that will promote the coexistence and co-prosperity and will be unaffected by changes in the Chinese political situation. The document also included suggestions for Japanese economic expansion into South China. This included tapping into the natural resources of the provinces of Fujian, Guangdong, and Guangxi, building a railway between Guangzhou and Suiyuan, and establishing air routes between Fuzhou and Taipei, which would connect to services in Japan and Thailand. It also called for survey teams to be dispatched to explore the resources of Sichuan, Gansu, Xinjiang, and Qinghai, and for support to be provided to the independence movement in Inner Mongolia. However, these initiatives presented significant challenges. The preface to the second outline of policy to deal with North China cautioned, "In implementing this policy, we must carefully consider the Nanjing government's prestige and avoid actions that could prompt it to adopt an anti-Japanese stance in response to the desires of the Chinese people." On September the 19th, 6 fundamental points for a settlement in North China were dictated to China to establish a common defense against communism, promoting economic cooperation, lowering tariffs, initiating an airline service between the two nations, employing Japanese advisors, and controlling subversive Koreans. September the 22nd was set as the deadline for a response from China. While agreeing to some of the Japanese requests, the Chinese included several counter-demands that the Japanese found completely unacceptable. These demands required Japan to, quote, A. Refrain from using armed intervention or arbitrary actions in the dealings with China. B. Recognize China as an equal and sovereign state. C. Avoid leveraging anti-government groups or communist elements. And D. Remove any derogatory references to China from Japanese textbooks. The Chinese also insisted that any agreement regarding North China must, quote, must precede the annulment of the Tangu and Shanghai ceasefire agreements, the disbanding of the East Hubei regime, and prohibition of unauthorized Japanese flights over North China, a ban on smuggling activities by the Japanese, the restoration of China's right to control smuggling, and the disbandment of the illegal East Hubei government along with the armies of Huang Ying and Prince De in Suiyuan. Now that mention of Prince De in Suiyuan brings us to a whole new incident, and honestly this podcast series should be retitled The History of Japanese-Related Incidents in China. Now we've spoken at great length about Japan's obsession with Manchuria. She wanted it for resources, growing space, and as a buffer state. Japan also had her eyes set on Inner Mongolia, to be used as a buffer state between Manchukuo, the USSR, and China proper. Not to mention, after the invasion of North China, Inner Mongolia could be instrumental as a wedge to be used to control North China. Thus, the Kuangtung Army began fostering a Mongolian independence movement back in August of 1933. They did so through a special organ led by the chief of the general staff, Koizo Kunyaki. He began work with the Selangor League, led by Prince Sonamurabdan, or Prince So, and another influential Mongol, Prince Denshogdongkrub, or Prince De. Prince De was the West Sunid banner North Chahar. Likewise, the Kuangtung Army was grooming Li Shixin, a Mongol commoner born in southern Manchuria. He had been a bandit-turned-soldier absorbed into Zhang Shiliang's army. Li Shixin had distinguished himself in a campaign against a group of Mongols trying to restore the Qing dynasty to further establish an independent Mongolia. During Operation Nika, Li had served as a cavalry brigade under Zhu Xingwu, reputed as the best unit in Zhang Shiliang's northeastern border defense army. He led the army's advance unit into western Shandong. Afterwards, Li suddenly became friends with Major Tanaka Hisashi, the head of the Special Servants Agency in Dongliao, where he defected to the Kuangtung Army. He soon was leading a force too strong to be incorporated into the Manchukuo Army, thus it was disbanded. But his Kuangtung Army buddies encouraged him to move to Turbulent in Ruhe Province. At one point during Operation Nika, Li's army was threatened by a strong Chinese counterattack, but they had Manchukuo air support allowing them to capture Turbulent. This victory launched what became the East Chahar Special Autonomous District, with Li becoming a garrison commander and the chief administrator. Back in time somewhat, upon the founding of the Chinese Republic, the affairs of Inner Mongolia fell upon the Bureau of Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs. This was reorganized in 1930 into the Commission of Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs when the provinces of Chahar, Suiyuan, and Ningxia were organized. Prince De had been a member of a nationalist group known as the Young Mongols, although his aim was self-determination for Inner Mongolia within China, not independence. The nationalist government's support for Chinese settlement in Mongol territories and its disregard for Mongol perspectives quickly triggered a rise in Mongol nationalism and anti-Chinese feelings. This was exacerbated by the government's introduction of a law on October the 12th of 1931, requiring local Mongolian administration units to consult the Xian officials on matters concerning their administration. The nationalist sentiment was further fueled by the presence of the neighboring Mongolian People's Republic in Outer Mongolia and the establishment of the Xingan province in western Manchuria by Manchukuo authorities in March of 1932. This new province included the tribes of Eastern Inner Mongolians and granted them greater autonomy than other Manchukuo provinces while banning Chinese immigration into it. When Nanjing did not react to these developments, Prince De and his supporters took steps towards gaining autonomy. On July the 15th of 1933, Mongolian leaders from western Inner Mongolia gathered at Pailingmao for 2 weeks to deliberate on the declaration of regional independence. Although many princes were initially hesitant to take this step, they reconvened on August 14th and sent a cable to Nanjing announcing their decision to create an autonomous Mongolian government. The cable was signed by Prince So and Prince De. Over the following 2 months, additional conferences at Pailingmao were held to organize the new government, which would be operating under Nanjing's guidance, but without involvement from the provincial chairman. On October the 22nd, Prince Yun, the head of the Ulanchap League and a close ally of Prince De, was elected to lead the new regime, with Prince De assuming the role of chief of its political affairs bureau. After receiving a cable from the Mongolian leaders in August, Nanjing quickly sent Minister of the Interior Hong Shaoheng and Xu Qingyang, the head of the Commission on Mongolian and Tibetan Affairs, to halt the movement. However, the Mongols declined to travel to Kalgan or Kesue to meet Huang. In November, as the leader of the special commission appointed by Nanjing, Huang reached an agreement with Princes Yun and De and other Mongolian leaders concerning the proposal that they would abandon the Mongols' demand for an autonomous government. This agreement was later altered by Nanjing, and its essential points were excluded from a measure approved by the Central Political Council of the Kuomintang on January 17th of 1934. The dispute reignited, fueled by the nationalist government's rising concerns over the anticipated enthronement of Puyi Manchukuo. On February the 28th, the Central Political Council enacted a measure that outlined 8 principles of Inner Mongolian autonomy and created the Mongolian Local Autonomous Political Council. Since these principles did not grant authority over foreign and military affairs, powers explicitly reserved for the central government in the January measure, they were seen as a concession to the Mongols and they were accepted. On March the 7th, the central government issued regulations to establish a semi-autonomous regime for Inner Mongolia, which was officially launched in Palingmiao on April the 23rd. Although the council was led by 3 moderate princes, Prince Yun supported by Prince So and Sha, the real administrative authority was held by Prince De, who served as the Secretary General. Most of the 25 council members were of Mongolian royalty, through which Prince De aimed to fulfill his objectives. Nevertheless, the nationalist government seemed to consider the council merely a token gesture to placate De, as Nanjing never provided the promised administrative funds outlined in the 8 Principle Declaration. It was not much of a shock when Prince De sought support from the Kuangtung Army, which had established contact with him as early as June of 1934. Japanese pressures in North China were starting to alter the power dynamics, and after the first Western incident in Johol in February of 1935, it compelled the relocation of Song Suiyuan's army from Chahar and Hubei, providing encouragement to Prince De. In May, he met with the Kuangtung Army Vice Chief of Staff Itagaki Seishiro, Intelligence Section Chief Kawabe Torashiro, and Staff Officer Tanaka Reikiichi, where they were officially informed for the first time about the Kuangtung Army's intention to assist him. On July the 25th, the Kuangtung Army drafted its Essentials of Policy towards Inner Mongolia, which regarded Japanese support for cooperation between De and Li Shushen as part of their strategic preparations for a potential conflict with the USSR. Shortly after this policy was adopted, a conflict arose over who had the authority to appoint the head of the Mongol Xiukong Manor, situated north of the Yellow River, and Paozhou. Following the death of the previous administrator, Prince Su declared that he had taken control of the position. In response to a request from the local abbot, Prince Yun, acting in his capacity as chairman of the Mongolian Political Council, dismissed Su. Su then turned to Nanjing through Suiyuan provincial chairman Fu Zouyi, arguing that the central government held the ultimate authority to appoint heads of the administrative units. In retaliation, Prince De dispatched troops to Xiukong, and on November the 10th, Fu Zouyi presented a mediation proposal which would be rejected since it not only failed to acknowledge Shu's dismissal but also demanded the withdrawal of De's forces. De then refused to pull back, further intensifying his hostility towards the Nanjing government. In December, the Kuangtung Army attempted to move Li's forces from eastern Chahar into the 6th Shun, north of Kalgan, which serves as Chahar's granary. Following the Chindohara Agreement, Matsue Genosuke from the Kalgan Special Service Agency secured a deal that would separate these 6 districts, those being the Shun, from the southern region predominantly populated by the Chinese. A Mongolian Peace Preservation Corps would be tasked with maintaining order in the northern area. Meanwhile, a Chinese corps would be responsible in the south. During the discussions for an autonomous regime centered around Song Suiyuan in North China in November of 1935, the Kuangtung Army troops were concentrating around Gubeikou. To exert pressure on Song Suiyuan's rear, the Kuangtung Army proposed replacing the Chinese Peace Preservation Unit in the area north of Kalgan with Li's army, which would establish this territory as its base. This operation commenced on December the 8th. In a surprise attack just before dawn, Li captured Paochang. By December the 12th, despite facing strong Chinese resistance and the heaviest snowfall seen in 60 years, Li, aided by Kuangtung Army aircraft disguised as those of the Manchukuo Airline Corporation, had taken control of Kuyuan. Further advances were halted by an order from the Kuangtung Army headquarters, and on the 13th it was reported that had the operation not been stopped, Tokyo would issue an imperial command. The operation had faced opposition from the Tianjin Army, which feared it would weaken Song Suiyuan's position, just as they were informing Tokyo that the autonomy movement was actually going smoothly. Additionally, both Britain and the United States publicly expressed strong opposition to the Kuangtung Army's involvement in the autonomy movement. However, the directive was ultimately prompted by the Emperor's anger upon discovering that a unit of the Kuangtung Army, led by Colonel Matsue Takero, had advanced to Toulon to support Li's progress. Although Li's advance was halted, the operation undeniably contributed to the formation of the Hubei Chahar Political Council. And although the operation was halted, the Kuangtung Army remained committed to its objectives. They contended that Li's army advanced into the 6 districts north of Kalgan, and that this was merely the peace preservation unit moving into the territory within the truce line established by the Tangu Agreement. Consequently, on December the 29th, they ordered Li to advance southward. Li peacefully occupied Changpei the following day, and then he entered Shangtu on December the 31st. Manchukuo civil officials were appointed to oversee the 6 districts, and the currency of Manchukuo was introduced, although the existing taxation system initially remained unchanged. The Kuangtung Army allocated silver worth about 6 million yuan to support the administrative expenses. This outcome, known as the Eastern Chahar Incident, marked a complete success for the Kuangtung Army, which then redirected its focus towards Suiyuan province. Each year, the Kuangtung Army developed a secret plan for covert operations. In 1936, there was a plan that included strategies to secure air bases for routes connecting Europe and Asia, targeting Qinghai and Xinjiang provinces, Outer Mongolia, Western Mongolia, and even remote areas in Ningxia. In January of 1936, Staff Officer Tanaka Ryukichi formulated a document titled Essentials of Policy Towards Northwestern Inner Mongolia. This document advocated for the establishment of a Mongolian military government to facilitate Japanese operations in northwestern Mongolia and suggested pushing Fuzhou out of Suiyuan into Shanxi province. Tanaka's proposals were incorporated into the final plan of the Kuangtung Army, ultimately leading to the Suiyuan Incident of November 1936. By February of 1936, a meeting at Pailingmao, where Prince Du proposed the independence of Inner Mongolia, resulted in the departure of Prince So and several other Mongolian leaders from the coalition. They instead sought to establish a rival political council at Kaohsiung under the protection of Fuzhou. By April, Du and his supporters declined to form a military government at Tuha in Chahar, which was officially inaugurated in June as the Inner Mongolian government, headed by Du and Li Shoxin as his deputy. This new government quickly signed a mutual assistance treaty with Manchukuo, and the emperor granted Du the title of prince. In July, there was a conference in Tuha, where Tanaka was appointed as head of the Special Service Agency for Inner Mongolia, with the mission of implementing the army's intelligence section plans. He traveled to Pingqichuan alongside the chief of staff at the time, which was Itagaki, and the intelligence chief Muto Akira, to propose a local anti-communist government with Fuzhou. After failing to convince Fuzhou, he attempted to persuade Sun Tinying to form a puppet army, but managed to recruit only a bandit army from Suiyuan, led by Wang Ying. The February 26 mutiny in Tokyo would heighten anti-Japanese sentiment in China, resulting in even further violence. By August, the construction of an airplane hangar in Paotou was halted due to riots by local Chinese residents. On August 13th, a group of 15 Japanese, led by Nakajima Manzo, was ambushed while delivering ammunition to a pro-Japanese leader who was shortly thereafter assassinated. Chinese soldiers from Wang Qingkuo's 70th Division carried out the attack. And tensions escalated as the arrival of the ammunition and Japanese laborers in Kalgan prompted border villages to strengthen their defenses. By late September, Tanaka's guidelines for the execution of the Suiyuan Operation received approval, with operations set to commence in early November. The plan evolved from a covert mission into a personal initiative by Tanaka, financed largely through funds from the Kuangtung Army's secret services and profits from special trading in eastern Hubei. Special trading referring to, of course, the drug trade. Tanaka claimed to have transported 600,000 yen to Tuha in October and later some 200,000 yuan into Inner Mongolia, estimating total expenses at approximately 6 million yuan. He acquired new weaponry from disbanded Northeast Army units and established 3 clandestine forces. Wang Ying led 500 men, including some artillery. Qin Xiashan commanded 3,000 from Sun Tiying's army, and Cheng Putang also led 3,000 specialized units. During strategic meetings, Tanaka dismissed proposals for unified command and refused to integrate secret units into the Mongolian army. He advocated for the slogan, "Overthrow Chiang Kai-shek," while Matsue managed to include independence for Inner Mongolia. The Japanese had developed the entire battle strategy themselves. The First Army, commanded by Li Shixin, would serve as the left flank, while the Second Army, led by Prince Du, would be positioned on the right. Wang Ying's forces were designated as the central force. Their initial targets would be Hongort, Xinghe, Tuchongzu, and Guxi City, followed by a division to seize Jing'ing, Baotou, and Hitao. On November the 13th, Prince De and Wang Ying's forces left Shangde in 2 columns to assault Xinghe and Hongort. By the 15th, 1,500 troops reached Hongort, where they engaged the 1st Cavalry Division led by Peng Yubin. The next day, Ryukichi Tanaka, then acting as Prince De's chief advisor, sent 2 cavalry brigades and 1 infantry brigade to capture the town, effectively overrunning its defenders. Meanwhile, Wang Ying dispatched a smaller group to secure Tuchongzi. Fu Zuoyi established his headquarters in Jining on that same day. After assessing the situation, he concluded that if the enemy secured Hongort, it would diminish his defenders' morale. Consequently, he launched a counterattack. Peng Yubin led a joint force of the 1st Cavalry Division and Dong Qiwu's 218th Brigade to confront around 400 of Wang Ying's men defending Hongort and Tuchongzi. By 7 a.m. on the 18th, Tuchongzi was reclaimed, and at 8:30 a.m., the 1st Cavalry Division entered Hongort, charging through 500 of Wang Ying's soldiers. The struggle for Hongort persisted for 3 days, resulting in nearly 1,000 casualties before Fu Zuoyi regained control. As the tide shifted against the invaders, Fu Zuoyi initiated an offensive towards Bailing Temple, the rear base of the enemy. It was quite well stocked and defended by 3,000 men under Prince De. Fu Zuoyi ordered the 2nd Cavalry Division, along with the 211th and 315th Brigades, the 21st Artillery Regiment, and a convoy of 20 trucks and 24 armored vehicles to assault the Bailing Temple as rapidly as possible. Taking advantage of the Mongolian chaos, Fu Zuoyi's 35th Brigade executed a flanking maneuver west of the Bailing Temple amidst a very severe snowstorm. At about 1 a.m. on the 24th, the battle for the Bailing Temple commenced as the Chinese engaged the Mongolians for the fortified positions around the temple. From 2 to 4 a.m., the Chinese advanced closer to the temple walls, facing artillery and machine gun fire. They launched desperate frontal assaults against the city gates, suffering heavy casualties. A fierce stalemate ensued, with the Japanese aerial bombardments causing significant casualties to the Chinese. Fu Zuoyi subsequently ordered all armored vehicles to converge on the main city gate. Despite intense fire, the armored cars managed to breach the gate, allowing the Chinese infantry to flood into the temple area. The resulting carnage within the temple area walls led 900 Mongols to die, with 300 captured as the rest fled for their lives. The Chinese would suffer 300 casualties, but they secured the strategically vital rear base, along with a substantial stockpile of provisions, including 500 barrels of petrol, 600 rifles, 10 machine guns, some vehicles, and field guns. Following the devastating defeat at the Bailing Temple, the invaders regrouped at Shilamulang Temple. On the 28th, the Japanese sent 100 vehicles to transport 3,000 troops to prepare for a significant counteroffensive to recapture the Bailing Temple. Then on the 29th, Wang Ying personally led 2,000 cavalry north of Shangdu to Taolin in an attempt to contain the enemy. However, after he left the bulk of his forces at the Shilamulang Temple, officers from the Grand Han Righteous Army secretly began negotiating to defect to the Chinese side, undermining the forces needed for the counterattack against the Bailing Temple. Nonetheless, the counteroffensive commenced on December the 2nd with 10 armored vehicles and 1,000 Mongol troops leading the charge at 6 a.m. They were pushed back by the heavily fortified 211th Brigade, which was well supplied with machine guns and artillery. The following day at 3 a.m., the Mongols attempted a surprise attack, but they faced an ambush as they crept towards the temple. They incurred hundreds of casualties, with 230 men either captured or having defected. After this, the counterattack stalled, as the Mongol forces couldn't approach within 3 miles of the temple. Subsequently, the Chinese 2nd Cavalry Division launched a pincer maneuver, causing significant casualties amongst the invaders. By 9 a.m., the enemy had suffered 500 casualties and was in a full retreat. At about 7 p.m., Fu Zuoyi ordered another counteroffensive. By the next morning, hundreds more had been lost and several hundred soldiers were captured. With such heavy losses, the defense of the Shilamulang Temple weakened significantly, prompting more officers to defect to the Chinese. Late on the 4th, Fu Zuoyi assembled a force comprising 2 cavalry regiments, 1 infantry regiment, 1 artillery battalion, 4 armored vehicles, and a squadron of other cars to launch a nighttime assault on the Shilamulang Temple. Meanwhile, the 2nd Cavalry Division clashed with Wang Ying's cavalry about 30 miles northeast of Wulanhai. Wang Ying's 2,000 cavalry had been raiding nearby villages trying to create diversions, drawing enemy forces away from the Bailing Shilamulang Temple Theater. However, by the 9th, Wang Ying's cavalry were encircled near Shaibei, where they were almost annihilated, with Wang Ying barely escaping with around 100 guards towards Changpei. Back on the 7th, some Grand Han Righteous Army officers set into motion plans to defect to the Chinese side. Early on the 9th, these officers led their men to invade the residence of the Japanese advisors, killing all 27 Japanese officers under Colonel Obama. Simultaneously, Fuzoyi's forces executed a flanking maneuver against the Shaolin Temple amidst all this chaos. With mass defections, the Chinese forces surged into the temple area, resulting in the invader army completely disintegrating into confusion as they surrendered. After seizing the temple, the invaders were routed, their lines of communication were severed, and only isolated pockets would continue to resist. Taking full advantage of the confusion, Fuzoyi launched simultaneous attacks attempting to capture Shangdu. However, Yan Xishan sent him a telegram ordering him to stop, stating that Shangdu fell under the jurisdiction of Shanxi and not Suiyuan. In response to the terrible loss, Tanaka planned a counteroffensive with Qin's troops, but Chiang Kai-shek commanded a strong defense of Pailingmiao, successfully outmaneuvering Tanaka's strategy. The resurgence of Chinese forces led to the disintegration of Qin's troops, who revolted and eventually joined the nationalist army. The Kuangtung Army aimed to redeploy its own forces for recovery, but faced opposition from Tokyo, which criticized the entire situation. After Chiang Kai-shek was kidnapped by Zhang Shiliang on December the 12th, and yes, we're going to talk about that in the next episode, it's a wild story, Tanaka and Prince Du seized an opportunity to reassess their strategy. Ultimately, the Kuangtung Army decided to abandon efforts to reclaim Pailingmiao, marking the official end of the hostilities on December the 21st. The Suiyuan incident, as it would become known, ultimately strengthened Chinese resolve against the Japanese and increased international distrust. And yeah, you heard that right. This is a victory for China for once. The defeat of Japan's proxy forces inspired many Chinese to advocate for a more vigorous resistance against the Japanese. The triumph in Suiyuan was celebrated throughout China and surprised the international media, marking the first occasion where the Chinese army successfully halted a Japanese unit. Delegations traveled from as distant as southern Chinese provinces to encourage the defenders to continue their fight. Captured Japanese weapons and equipment served as proof of Japan's involvement in the conflict, despite Japan's foreign minister, Hachiro Arita, claiming, quote, "Japan was not involved in this conflict in Suiyuan at all." After his terrible defeat, Prince Du and his Inner Mongolian troops retreated to northern Chahar, where he had to reconstruct his army due to significant losses. The Japanese implemented new regulations for the Mongolian army to enhance its effectiveness, and efforts to recruit new soldiers commenced, because the Japanese were not done. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both narrated and written by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. I just released a full documentary covering the defense of the Great Wall of China in 1933, found on my YouTube channel, and over on Echoes of War, we are finishing up our multi-part series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. More incidents and more battles to seize territory raged in North China. However, things did not go according to plan for the Japanese and their puppets. The tides had turned, and now more angry and invigorated Chinese would begin lashing out against the encroachment. It was only a matter of time before a full-blown war was declared.